Welcome to episode 2 of the Silmarillion sessions. I'm Dr. Mikael Thompson, and this is William Lasseter, and today we're going to be discussing the Ainalundale, the opening work of the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. And actually, in many ways, it's a book preceding the Silmarillion proper. So as we mentioned on the last episode, the Silmarillion proper starts actually a little ways into the literary work, the tome there that we have before us of the Silmarillion as a whole. There's two books at the beginning, the Ainalundale, which is the story of the creation of Middle-earth, and we introduce the Iluvatar and the Ainur, and then the second book is the Valaquenta, which is an account of the Valar and the Maiar according to the lore of the Eldar, that is, of the elves. So the Ainalundale is the story of the singing into creation on the part of God and, I suppose we could say, the other celestials, the other spirits of the celestial court, to draw upon an ancient image there. But Will, why don't you kick us off with what we're going to be walking through today with that?
Well, yeah, thank you, Dr. Thompson. I find that a lot of people who have read Lord of the Rings and love Lord of the Rings, or who have read Hobbit and love Hobbit, they come up against the Silmarillion, and it's a bit of a wall for them. It's a bit of a chew, and so part of the art design in this is to show the gems that are there in Tolkien's work, in the mine of Tolkien's work. But I think also to show people that there is a structure to this, there's an order to it that you can follow, you can tackle this. So one of the first things to point out here is that Tolkien was working on this really actively from 1917 onwards, although there are bits and pieces that show up as early as his childhood, as we said yesterday, or last episode, whatever it was. But he really didn't ever put it together into one work himself. It was put together by his son, Christopher, and published in 1977. And so you're getting a work which is, the pieces fit, but they are almost like, it's a different thing you're encountering when you first encounter it. So when you rush in, you're like, I'm going to read the Silmarillion, you come to the Ainalundale, and you're like, that's beautiful. But then you get to that list of names in Valaquenta, and you're like, I don't know if I can do this. And then you get into the Quenta Silmarillion, it's more elvish names. You're like, I don't know if I can do this at all. So the thread can be lost if we're not careful here. So one of the first things to point out, yes, the Quenta Silmarillion is the actual story, and it's the story of the elves primarily, as they are interacting with not just one another over these beautiful objects called Silmarils, but also as they're interacting with the demonic powers of Sauron and Morgoth and the like in Middle-earth. And that's where we get all these different stories of the elves and later of men as they're interacting with one another. It's far more narrative based. These first two opening parts are not really about elves per se, and they're not about men per se. They're more about the godlike powers.
Mm-hmm.
And in Tolkien's mind, that was already there. He sets it down to paper, and then he goes to work on the Quenta Silmarillion, and years later, his son, putting these things together, says, well, the Ainalundale and the Valaquenta fit. They fit into the work. So really, I think it's kind of important to think of it that way. If I guess you could say, if you want to skip right to the story, you skip right to the Quenta Silmarillion, you skip the Ainalundale and the Valaquenta. But I think those two parts they're pretty crucial to understanding the worldview, the matrix, the whole playground that he's working in. Because not just because he makes reference to these gods, but because it's like their original creating of the world and their original enumeration, that is who they are, kind of sets the stage for a repeated pattern that we see in the Quenta Silmarillion. Okay, so
right.
That's what I was hoping to do today. We were hoping to take people through this sort of the structure and point out some neat pieces that we see in the Ainalundale and see how that fits into Tolkien's imaginative world.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense because in the Ainalundale we've got then it's an account of creation, not only sort of in a way that's chronologically prior it happens before
Yeah.
the Silmarillion, but so that, okay, it's important to know who the gods are when they show up in the Silmarillion. Okay, I have a sense of how they're related to one another, because much of the beginning part of the Silmarillion is in fact the gods interacting with each other. The elves haven't awoken yet until a couple of chapters in, so we don't even get the first, we can't call them mortals, but mortal humanoid-like things until some ways into the Silmarillion. But actually, as we'll see, and this is something I would point out, as we'll see in the Ainalundale itself tells us within the text that it is the key to understanding what happens in not only the Silmarillion, but the whole of the legendarium of Middle-earth, because it's more like, rather than something that's merely antecedent, it's in fact, as we see, the singing into creation of the whole world. That the initial song is more like a blueprint of the whole thing completed. So it's the sheet music, as it were, of the symphony that then plays out before our eyes in time, right? I mean, that's...
And that great point. And as a sake of a question of clarity here, we've got Ainalundale and we've got Valaquenta. And for people that don't speak Elvish, which is probably at least a few folks, what does that mean? What are we talking about? Those titles alone? What do the titles mean?
Right. So the two or three people out there who aren't fluent in Quenya, myself included, I'll work backwards. We'll start with the Silmarillion, the quenta Silmarillion. So Silmarillion is simply the grammatical form of a thing about the Silmarils. The Silmarils, in the same way, what the Odyssey is something about Odysseus, and the Iliad is the story about, well, Ilium, which is the old word for Troy, right? In the same way, the Silmarillion is about the Silmarils, these jewels that were fashioned with a lot of other things attendant on them. In the same way, a jewel might be set in a crown surrounded by gold encrusting and all of that. But quenta essentially means story, and this isn't, one need not even delve into the language of Elvish. I myself haven't, but as a philologist, it should be recognizable. I can say that it should be this word should be recognizable to us because it's etymologically related to our word account or accounting. So in the sense that you might see more in French or in Italian, the racconto, a history, a story of something. And so the quenta Silmarillion is the accounting of the Silmarils, that story, that tale, that lay. In the similar vein, then Valaquenta, put as one word, you've got that racconto, a recounting of the Valar, the gods. Or the Valar and the Maiar, and what are we talking? What exactly those are? But we'll say generically the gods, and we'll go more into detail in that later. And then the Ainulindale is I forget exactly all the parts of this, but the idea, it's the singing or the music of the Ainur. So the Ainu, we've got this the Ainur themselves, which is, you could also say sort of the god. It's the name. It's what we call the Valar before they enter into the world that's created, into the material creation. Before they start interacting with it, they have a different kind of name. We'll talk about how those all relate to each other. And then lundale. I'm a bit fuzzy on this. Maybe you remember better than I do. One of those has to do with singing, like Linda or something like that, and Dale or Ale is another word, but I don't recall exactly what that is. But you got three words there.
Well, wizards don't normally reveal their secrets, but I'll reveal a secret here. One of them, I have a great website. If I can share it here on the screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me see if I can do this in the magic of modern technology, right? This is a great website for anybody who is delving into Tolkien and wants a leg up, because you can look really intelligent like we do. And this here is a dictionary online of Elvish, and it's literally the Elvish dictionary online. So elfdict.
Elfdict.com.
Elfdict.com.
Remember a T, kids.
And basically, you can type in any Elvish word, and you can find the word and its origins down below. Okay, so this is it's a Quenya dictionary, and this quenta in general, it says here, is a story or a narrative or account or history. to speak with rational words or vocal speech. And then it gives you all these different related words like quentale and valaquenta. It has elements where it shows up, variations of it. What it doesn't give necessarily, it doesn't give its relationship in Tolkien's mind to other words necessarily. So I don't know whether or not we can, like, how did he come up with this word, quenta? I don't know for sure. Or did he have other words in mind when he created this word? I don't know for sure. But certainly in terms of its linguistic pattern, it is closely connected to a count or recounting. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Most of Tolkien's stuff, from what I understand, and experts, I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but most of his languages are based upon Finnish and Germanic. Finnish and Germanic.
Finnish and Welsh for the
Welsh.
elves, and then the Germanic languages for so like the Rohirrim. Yeah, and the Dwarvish languages are famously very Semitic.
Oh, okay.
Whether that's a closer Hebrew, Syriac, he uses the phonemes from the Semitic language family for that, with a little bit of sort of Persian kind of stuff mixed in every once in a while, at least in terms of the phonemes. The languages, of course, are all invented, but remember, and I think it's important to remember, the whole premise of all of these, the whole of Middle Earth Legendarium, the whole premise is that it's an ancient history
Yes.
of our own world,
Yes.
so that there's got to be a plausibility as he's inventing these languages. And this actually, in many ways, predates the narratives that he comes up with to give them life and incarnate them in many ways in a story. Is that playing with the languages, there was this idea already in beginning to play with these languages, that this is an ancient language from a history before history of a people or peoples that spoke these kinds of things, so that there's a plausibility of evolution over time into our own modern languages.
Yeah,
and we see that kind of linguistic evolution even within the Silmarillion, which spans thousands and thousands of years. But the idea that it shouldn't shock us, but it should delightfully surprise us when we see similarities or feel resonances between certain words or certain sounds.
Now you say play with the language. I'm sure you mean play with the language on the one hand as Ludus, as a child plays, but also play with the language as a master plays on the lute, for instance, a musical playing.
Precisely.
Because Tolkien, my understanding is that Tolkien, he was one of the key players in putting together the Oxford Dictionary. And so he did hours of research, putting together words, looking up the origins of words, etymologies of words. He was himself very aware of the emerging theories about Indo-European languages and the connections of languages. And so he was not, I mean, he's no small cheese in terms of linguistic study. He's still considered one of the greatest philologists of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
Aside from his dabbling in fantasy, his little side gig in fantasy. So his playing is like
his day job. He was a word professor.
That's right. Yeah, that's where he made his money, right? Because philology, how much money.
Yes.
But it was like you're listening to a Christopher Parkening, for instance, or somebody like that playing on the guitar. He was absolutely a virtuoso in terms of languages. So I do not doubt at all that his various languages emerged from different Indo-European or Semitic languages that he was familiar with. That's why we see so much influence there. The other word, just quick, the other word, lundale, that's also in the dictionary here. This is, lundale means literally music. The word is cited as lundale in the printed etymologies, but according to the VT 4527, I'm not sure what that means. This is a misreading for lundale in Tolkien's manuscript. The word lundale may argue the existence of a verbal stem, which is linda, sing or make music.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, and it's interesting to find these things out in the dictionary, that online dictionary, because you see the connections of these words. And my point in bringing it up originally was to say, okay, first off, the titles, they seem daunting because they're Elvish, but if you break them down, you understand this is simply the song of the Ainur and the recounting of the Vala, and then the recounting of the Silmarils as well.
Yeah, which is, much the same way as we might approach something more familiar, I think, to many of our listeners and viewers, the books of the Bible. I mean, we talk about Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, right? Well, Genesis just means the coming into being. That's just the Greek word for coming into being. Exodus means the way out, and or the road out, really, the road out. And Deuteronomy means the second law. A lot of these things that are very technical in the way in our common parlance or uncommon parlance of our times, are really just Greek. They're not fancy. They're just regular Greek words for really low-level speech in our own tongue. We just have a sense of things that feel Saxon, feel more down to earth or low class, and things that feel Greco-Roman or things that are from Greco-Roman derivation feel like they're up high or they're technical. But really, when you translate them, it breaks down to all the same. It's all the same at the end, man.
So and that's just and that's true for a lot of stuff. Is technical language. It's just once you get the handle of it, it's not that big a deal. So back to the text. One of the things that I find, because I think you brought this up a little earlier in our conversation, which is his using the language in order to create a verisimilitude, or to create the language first, and then the world kind of emerged from it in a way, gave it shape.
Exactly. That's precisely it. You create the language, and the world emerges from it.
Yeah, I think we would be remiss if we didn't refer to some degree to one of the letters of Tolkien, and I think this is he wrote so many letters that have been preserved in the Tolkien letters collected, and one of them that's really insightful for understanding what he was doing was 131, Tolkien 131. Now, as Tolkien himself says. He says it's better to, something to the effect of, it's better to enjoy the soup rather than to try and find out all the bones that went into it. But nevertheless, I would speak for you too. I take a great deal of pleasure in finding out the bones and trying to reconstitute the ox from which the soup came. So these are the bones to some degree. This is Tolkien's letter 131 to Milton Waldman, and if you don't mind, I'd like to just read a little bit of this letter.
Please do.
Waldman. So in this letter, he's basically talking about the origins of this entire cosmos. And I'll share the letter here. He's talking about the origins of his cosmos, and he has a couple interesting things that I think need addressing here, because he could have done all sorts of things to write on, and I've often wondered why he didn't want to do the Arthurian world. But he makes this point here in the text, and he says, of course there was and is all the Arthurian world, but powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associated with the soil of Britain, but not with English, and does not replace what I felt to be missing. For one thing, its fairy is too lavish and fantastical, incoherent and repetitive. For another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary real world. Speaking, of course, of our present, intending the word to be understood in its ancient meanings, which continued as late as Spenser, and rain on Will Shakespeare and his damned cobwebs, though I have thought about them a good deal, situation not of ancient pagan pre-Christian days, and I will not repeat what I tried to say in my essay, which you read. So he's referring to another essay. That's the point. So first thing to note is, why didn't he write an Arthurian epic? Why did he decide to go and write his own sort of fairy story, if you will? And why does he make this statement at the very start, the very outset? It is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion for reasons which I will not elaborate. That seems to me fatal. That statement about it being fatal seems odd. So anyway, he says here that the explicitly Christian imagery or imagery from the Christian religion is fatal, he says. And by the way, this can be found, for those who are interested, this can be found in this copy as well. It's in the front of the book. It's page XVI or 16 in the vernacular. So basically, I'm curious, what do you make of that statement that he says here, and how does it affect what, especially as Christians, how does it affect how we address the work? One could read it, I suppose, on the one hand, if he says, Christian religion is particularly fatal. You could
Hmm.
read it negatively and say, well, this is not a Christian work. This is a work of magic and of, I've heard people say this.
Yeah, well, and it's not precisely in this part that he's addressing. That we said he's addressing it head on.
Yeah.
In terms of whether his stuff is a Christian work or not. It's of course not. It's patently absurd. It's patently not that. It's not an anti-Christian work or an un-Christian work. It's a pre-Christian work, and he says so in many, many places. I mean, as I said before, like, Christianity started at a certain point in time. It's kind of one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity. Under the reign of Caesar Augustus, these things happened, and a decree went out, and so on. Like at such and such a date, in Jimmy's third year of his praetorship or whatever. Like, so we know exactly when it happened.
Yeah.
As I said, his project is to write. The whole premise of the Legendarium is that it's something that goes back, like that. This plausibly is putatively is meant to be happening. What, I don't know, 100,000 years before Christ. I mean, this is in ancient prehistory days. What the idea when we get to it in the fall of Numenor, this kingdom of men, this island bigger than an island, right? Really a large country out across the sea from what we know and love as as the Hobbit's Middle Earth, way out into the sinks. This civilization, very advanced civilization, thrown under the waters, is supposed to be the idea. Well, that's actually the origin of where we get our Lost City of Atlantis sort of myths,
Okay.
and many other things besides. He works in, and he even writes into the Fellowship of the Ring in Bree, the song that Frodo sings. This all comes back around, I promise. The song that Frodo sings when he's dancing on the table and he falls and slips, and the ring slips onto his finger. And he's singing this song about a cat and a fiddle, and the man and the moon came down, and then at the end, the cow jumps over the moon, and the dog. This is one of Tolkien's favorite games to play as a philologist, is to project back and write the plausible original version of a manuscript, right? And so he does this with the song, the hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, the little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. We know these nursery rhymes. And one of the big things for Tolkien is that a lot of these so-called nursery rhymes or old wives' tales and fables are really just the remaining scraps of much larger works. And he shows us these little Easter eggs, as it were, throughout his books. And in this case, the story of the Hey Diddle Diddle Cat and the Fiddle, it's actually like a 10 strophe song in its original form, this putatively original form. And he does this with Beowulf. He's famously the translator of Beowulf. He's the one who brings Beowulf to the fore as a scholarly work, as actually a work worth scholarly inquiry and research on. And he's got a wonderful translation of it. But one of the things that he did, and this is published with the translation, is that as part of his just fun scholarly exercises is to project back, the Beowulf poem written in Old English, Anglo-Saxon, in the 800s, more or less, right? And he projects back what is an original fable. What is the original version of the story, way back fable that gave rise to it? It's totally putative, totally fictional in that sense. But what's a plausible version of it that could have existed? And he did it. He wrote it in Old English, in this earliest version of Old English, Old Norse kind of language, so that then he could subsequently translate it into modern English and show it to us. So he creates this sort of intentional pious forgery as a putative, like, well, what possibly could have been the original manuscript? And then let's bring that forward. And that's what he's doing with the Lord of the Rings. It's definitely what he's doing with the Silmarillion, is projecting back what are these plausible myths and stories of a civilization, of a whole world of people, of our own Middle Earth, the world we live in, but way back in history, a long time ago. And so the notion of Christianity, I think one of the things he's talking about in this letter is what are the sources that he's drawing upon to, not within the literary frame of a putative backstory to the world we live in, but as an artist, as an author, as a creator, what are the sources of inspiration? And he talks about, as you mentioned, there's the Greek, the Celtic, the Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian, and Finnish. Especially the Finnish deeply impressed itself upon him, these legends, but he's addressing what he feels is the poverty of his own native land, that is England, the England of Englishmen,
Yeah.
not the England that was the Celtic Britain, Romano-Britain, where Arthur historically took place, and through its Frankish and Norman recension became the Arthurian legends that we know and love as they move back into Britain. He's saying there's something lacking. He feels at least a lack in our native English culture, of our own properly English mythology and legends and fairy stories. And so why is he, he mentions this Arthurian world. He says, powerful as it is, it is imperfectly naturalized. Oh, what does he mean with this? This is a criticism that he levels against to some degree, against the Beowulf as we have it, the final manuscript of Beowulf as well, is that it's clearly later impositions of an explicitly Christian hand, sort of comments that are written in. And he says, he's looking for something that's much more implicit and doesn't feel so artificial. It's not he's not against the Christian religion. We know the man, his life and his writings, you get very, very strong sense the other direction. But rather that he's trying to create something that's plausibly pre-Christian. You can't explicitly, have these, because the great one God who became man on such and such born of the Virgin Mary did decree back then, or because they did not yet know and they only worshipped the heathen gods. It just feels artificial.
That would be.
And so he's looking for something that's more grown out of the earth. Certainly something that can become redeemed in God's grace, can be transformed by the incarnation, but isn't sort of like a pietistic, post 16th century sort of pietistic fairy tale fable, very clearly allegorized from gospel principles or something like that. I mean, he's trying to avoid that because that just feels cheap.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's a really good take on it. One has to take into account that what he was working with too were things like Pilgrim's Progress, for instance, an allegorized story, very popular in English mythology, so to speak, about the progress of the human soul towards heaven. But everything in there is allegory. The slough of despond, and meeting these characters that represent sins and that kind of business. He didn't want that at all. And I think that he is definitely trying to make a world out of which could grow these fragments that developed into eventually our own culture, our English culture. I like that very much. I remember in The Hobbit where Bilbo says, "Never laugh at live dragons," and then it says, and this later on becomes a saying, and it was adapted. It's kind of like a representation of what you're talking about. There's another take on it too that I would offer, which I call the William Carlos Williams option.
Okay.
Those who are familiar with William Carlos.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, right. The William Carlos Williams option is that Williams wrote a lot of poetry that's very short and very to the point. And one of the more famous ones is The Red Wheelbarrow, where he writes, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens." And it's like, well, what the heck does that mean? Who knows what that means? Williams' point is that poetry and artwork make us see things fresh, see things anew, see the things that are around us from a different angle than we did before. So that a wheelbarrow, which is normally used for carrying dirt and poo, is propped up and covered with rainwater, so it's glistening, and it's surrounded by all these angelic characters, like chickens. And so suddenly you see that ordinary, mundane thing in a totally new light, and it's as though it were part of heaven already. And so Williams is suggesting that poetry does that for us, art does that for us.
Yeah.
In this case, I think there is an element to that, because I think that Tolkien's work, he says this in another place, Tolkien's work prompts us to see the world differently than we normally would see it. And it's an element, especially of fairy stories. You read similar sentiments in Chesterton's writing about fairy stories, and even in C.S. Lewis's writing about fairy stories. Fairy stories, by their nature, because they are separate from the world, they're like a world set apart in a way, prompt us to look differently at our own world, to see it anew. And I am of
Right.
the opinion that if you bring up imagery that's familiar to us, you bring up imagery that we've already put in a box. Christian imagery is
Yes.
beautiful and I love it. But so often we take the images of Christianity, we put it in a box, we say, I know what that is. I don't need to think about it anymore. It
Hmm.
is stripped of its real power, its potency. And in that case, we have basically the bones of a religion. We have the skeleton of a religion, not real spiritual sense at
Yeah.
all. So if we're going to,
Hmm.
if the project, okay, if he says that seems to be fatal, well, fatal to what? I think fatal to the
Right.
project he's trying to put forward, which is, as you said, to create a history, but also fatal to the project of making a fairy story, which is to refresh the mind, cleanse the palate, make us look at the world in a different way. It's fatal to both. It kills both. On the one hand, it kills it because everything becomes sort of jimmy rigged into the Christian thing, like the Pilgrim's
Right.
Progress. But it also kills it in the sense that it makes all of this stuff um, is known. It's oh well, that is obviously is what Saint Paul was saying. Oh well, that's obviously what's meant by when Christ does this parable, and we know it, and we can move on. We don't have to think about it anymore, and it doesn't shock us, and it doesn't amaze us, and it doesn't fill us with awe and wonder. And I think
Right.
that would be fatal because we, as
Yeah.
many people say, we've already got the Gospels. Why do we need to read anything else?
Thanks, I already got one. And I think that summarizes it right there. The Monty Python sketch, the encounter between Arthur and the French knight in the castle, is that we're on the quest for the Holy Grail. He says, no thanks, we already got one, you know?
Do you want this beautiful cup that was catching the blood of Christ and represents heaven and feminine beauty? Do you want that? Do you want? No, we've already got one. Yes. No. No, thank you.
And I think that's the criticism right there, is that you don't want to end up with something like, yeah, I've got this wonderful story. Like, nah, thanks, I've seen this already.
That's
I've already seen this one. The
that's
movie was
right.
better.
Just another
Um,
Avengers.
And it is. It would be fatal to that. And I think that's exactly. And this ties into the notion that we were discussing last episode, where he's talking about his whole project of subcreation. The
Yeah.
author, the artist, as sub-creator, as creating a secondary world, which can be in many ways a magical portal to us. The whole purpose of fairy story, as he elaborates in his essay on fairy stories, is that they're meant to be a portal. That actually, the fairy story itself is itself meant to do to us what often happens within a fairy story, is that somebody walks through a magical portal into another world. And
Mm.
that becomes then a portal for our escape from the prison that we may find ourselves in. Or if we're not in a prison, at least an amulet that affects the transmogrification of ourselves and the world around us, that we see it in a different way, that it changes for us so that we change in the world. And I think you hit it exactly right. If it brings elements of this world into it, what happens is what we so often see in some of the more powerful fairy stories, is that things from the mortal realm that go into the land of fairy, um, either destroy fairyland or themselves become perverse and corrupted.
Mm.
There's a crossing of the boundaries that certain things are not allowed to cross the boundaries. You bring things back from fairy into this world, and they can either twist and distort the person who carries them, or they themselves turn to ash and fall through your fingers.
Right.
And I think in the writing that this applies to that as well, in the creation of these stories.
Yeah, that's really interesting to bring that up because it's part of what you pointed out that spell is story, but
Yes,
spell
that's the
is
old
also
Saxon word
magic.
for it.
Spell is also
Yeah.
magic. It's magic,
Hmm.
and magic fails when you strip it of its mystery and its what you look for the bones of the ox rather than enjoying the soup. When
Right.
you start looking to see all the technique behind the play, you lose the point of Hamlet.
Hmm.
When you start trying to register all of the sound waves of the various voices, you lose the Tallis scholars and all that gorgeous polyphonic Renaissance music. You're not enjoying it anymore. And to some degree, I think a technician has to
Hmm.
do that. An artist has to do that because they have to know their materials. But the end product they're trying to create is greater than all the different pieces.
Right. I mean, if you look at a great painting, right, classic masters, Girl with a Pearl Earring, for example, and all you see is particles of pigment, you're missing the whole thing. You
Right.
know, the artist needs to know the particles of the pigment to go in to mix the paints and the create and the brush strokes. And in many ways, in some painters, at Van Gogh, the brush strokes are really what make the magic happen. But if all you see are the atomized parts, the constituent elements, you've destroyed the thing.
That's a good word. That's a good word. And honestly, I don't want to get too deep on this, but I really think that that right there is a huge problem of our modern world.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, something happened, and I say it's in 1277. That's when everything went to crap.
Good. Well, at least we've pinned down the date.
Yeah, right. But when we started looking for all of the atomized elements of things, breaking them into their constituent parts, we began as a culture to lose the overarching sound, music, piece of music.
Mm-hmm.
It was no more than just notes on page or pigments on a canvas. And not entirely tangentially, my son was telling me that in the physics world where they did this and they broke everything down to their atomized forms, literally, they thought, well, we'll find the mechanism that holds all the universe together. And strikingly, what they've really found most recently, they don't know how it holds together. They ultimately have no idea how all this works. And increasingly in the physics and other realms, the scientists are beginning to say, at the heart of things, there's a strange mystery. It's like we don't actually know and can never know. And
they seem to blip in and out of existence and do things entirely unexpected.
Like, what? It's like the Gödel's problem in mathematics that happened at the early part of the 20th century, where all the mathematicians got together and like, yeah, math will solve everything. And Gödel wrote, actually. And he proved that mathematics could not explain itself, let alone anything else, which is really startling to those who want a firm and absolute explanation for everything. So I guess
if I can insert a plug here, let's do things. To that very point, anybody who wants a really good romp through that sort of mysterious conundrum that you just identified, there is a book out there. I think the title of it is Gödel, Escher, Bach, and it does what it talks about within it. It's a phenomenal piece of it's a phenomenal artifact. It's a phenomenal piece of work. Gödel, Escher, Bach. I think that's the title of it, or it could be the subtitle, something like this. But really interesting trip for you on those same lines.
Yes, not a bad plug at all. Here is the rascal right here.
Yes, an eternal gold braid.
And it is
Gödel being Gödel, as you mentioned, Escher, MC Escher, the artist. Things go around in circles, and Bach, the cousin Johann, the famous composer.
Where things also go around in circles, apparently.
Indeed.
Yeah, so definitely a good thing to read if you want a big old deep delve into it. So, wow. Okay, so deep delve. We need to come back. Okay.
Back to the surface.
Back to the source. Letter 131 also raises something else, which I think is interesting and intriguing to look at. If you don't mind my going ahead and just doing that, I'm going to share that letter again. So he writes further on in the letter, and again, this is all in the front of that printing that we're using. This is an XVII or 17 for those who don't read Latin.
Speak the vulgar tongue.
The vulgar tongue. He says, I dislike allegory. And he says this numerous places, so this is funny that he just keeps repeating
dislike
it. I don't like allegory.
Passionately.
About allegory?
Yes.
Anyway, I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory. Yet any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language. And of course, the more life a story has, the more readily will it be susceptible of allegorical interpretations. While the better a deliberate allegory is made, the more nearly will it be acceptable just as a story. Anyway, all this stuff is mainly concerned with fall, mortality, and the machine. With fall inevitably, and that motive occurs in several modes. With mortality, especially as it affects art and the creative, or as I should say, subcreative, desire, which seems to have no biological function. and to be apart from the satisfaction of plain ordinary biological life with which in our world it is indeed usually at strife. This desire is at once wedded to a passionate love of the real primary world and hence filled with a sense of mortality, and yet unsatisfied by it. It has various opportunities of fall. It says it may become possessive, clinging to the things made as its own. The sub-creator wishes to be the Lord and God of his private creation. He will rebel against the laws of the creator, especially against mortality. Both of these, alone or together, will lead to the desire for power, for making the will more quickly effective, and so to the machine or magic. By the last, I intend all use of external plans or devices, apparatus, instead of development of the inherent inner powers or talents, or even the use of these talents with the motive of dominating, bulldozing the real world, or coercing other wills. The machine is our more obvious modern form, though more closely related to magic than is usually recognized. That's a lot to take in, true, but mainly the point to focus on here is that he talks about how all this stuff, which I'm assuming is his work, mainly concerned with fall, mortality, and the machine.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we're looking for a sort of what is Tolkien doing key, this is a pretty good one, I think.
Yeah.
I think his writing of the Silmarillion, his writing of the Hobbit, even his writing of the Lord of the Rings, is based around these three movements: fall, mortality, and the machine. So
Right.
to fall first, to take that apart, the first part of fall, you have to fall from somewhere, and
Right.
normally a high place, right? Because you're not just going to fall in your bedroom, I suppose. That's kind of sad, but that's not going to be dramatic.
Fall out of bed in the morning.
Oops. Fall normally is from a very high place to a low place. So we have to talk about the high place and what that is, and that's where we get this opening here on the Silmarillion. What was that high and low creation? Human beings, elves, dwarves, they weren't created just as an accident. They weren't created just as the blood of a rebel god. They weren't created as sort of stardust.
Right. It wasn't the backs of crystals slowly coming together by chance or accident, nor is it like you said, the blood of somebody slain sprinkled on the ground accidentally then became seeds that sprouted up as mortal man.
No. Or even, I was reading the other day in that Aesir war, the Norse war between the Aesir gods and the Ainur gods, that all of them get together and they spit into a pot, and the pot basically brews and becomes humans, becomes a man. So like God spit. Oh, that's not terribly.
God spit.
That's not terribly encouraging necessarily. And even the idea that we are created as the Greeks say that we are created as sort of toys for a titan, that's not really encouraging either. So.
Right, but it speaks to an outlook. I think in both of those is very interesting, and it speaks to an outlook on the meaning of life, a man's end, and the nature of the world, nature of our place in the world. And I would say that outlook is not, however, necessarily what we might think at first blush, but it does speak to a worldview.
Yeah, it does indeed. And so we talk about where does creation come from, and that's what we're going to be getting into here in the Ainalundale, certainly, and then the mortality. Mortality is once that fall occurs, what do you do with that single undeniable fact, which is death, the decay and death of all things, because that, like death and taxes, right, the two things you can't deny. Death is something which everybody has to grapple with, and it really becomes a defining feature of maturity, and even of spirituality and of holiness. How do you deal with death? That's it. Even philosophy itself is designed to be able to face death, and as he says, this affects everything we do, our art and our creative world. These things have no biological function. I find that interesting. There's no biological function to them. We don't create art in order to survive, or hunt better,
or merely impress a mate or something.
No, like, honey, look, I composed you a symphony.
Often not impressed.
Yeah, quite the opposite, actually. The dorks that are in band are not the ones that get all the babes. Uh, but it is something which is it usually says is that strife with the world. Normally, art is because art is in some ways, I think, grappling with the mortality. That's where we get our creative thing. And then finally, that art, as it deals with mortality, can sometimes be twisted to seek a way out of death, to overcome death, to make ourselves dominant over the world and thus not have to suffer death. And that's what he
Right.
refers to as the machine, or in this case, even magic.
Which are more closely linked than one might assume, than a
Sure,
modern
sure.
person might assume.
Yeah.
In fact, they're, just to spin off, they're essentially the same, and he alludes to this. And it's interestingly enough C.S. Lewis who makes it more explicit on the abolition of man, his essays there, that they're the same fundamental spiritual movement, spiritual impulse, machine, technocracy, right? Know-how, right? Technology, the machine, and magic, in the sense, and he goes on to explain later in this letter what distinctions of the concept of magic, but magic in the sense that we ordinarily think of franchise, witchcraft, artifice, alchemy, anything of this Faustian, Victor Frankenstein sort of manipulation of reality to achieve our ends. That these are the same. These are all working on the same lines. Whether we're calling on arcane powers to summon the dead or something, or whether we're using machines to generate artificial disembodied intelligences who can write our essays for us. It's the same essential impulse, right?
That's not magic. So he said, Siri, write me an essay on magic and how it relates to AI.
That's right. I'm
No, you're
sorry.
absolutely right. You're absolutely
I can't do that, Dave.
You're absolutely right. And I think it's a really good segue. If we look at this idea of the fall and mortality and magic, it's a really good segue to look at two aspects that do appear in our text here in the Ainalundale. The first one that I wanted just to address, because it's in no particular order, is this concept of the void. We get all the singing that goes on, and the children of Iluvatar developing in that singing, but the Ainur themselves are part of that singing, except for Melkor. Melkor goes off into the void, and he communes with the void, and he enters into the void at some point when he's exiled. And there's even a portion here, I think, if I don't mind my getting ahead a little bit, at the end of the Valaquenta, it says, in after years, he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void. That's Sauron doing that. So even the Valaquenta ends with that word of the void.
Void.
Yeah, the void.
Right. And if I can give some sense for those of you who are about to enter into the Ainalundale, we salute you. Exactly right. Resisting asking if they are ready to rock, but
I think so.
yes. Basic outline of what happens is that in the beginning there's Eru, the one who is also called Iluvatar. Well, he's got many names. This is God, right? The God figure, the one. There's the holy ones, which that is a direct allusion. That he's using that in the same way that we should understand when we see the holy ones in scripture or in famous hymns like "All ye watchers and ye holy ones." Those are allusions to these celestial beings. So this should make you a little uncomfortable if you tend towards one sort of side of a spectrum of late Renaissance, early modern version of Christianity view of the world. There are many things. There are more things in heaven and on earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your philosophies. You've got the one, you've got these other gods, the celestial court of these other spirits that are clearly created. They're subordinate to the highest. They're not the high god. There are these other things. And he calls them to sing. and they sing a great symphony together. Melkor, one of them, Melkor, who later becomes named Morgoth, he was a very powerful one, perhaps one of the most intelligent, but he goes off and kind of does his own thing and creates discord. You know, his singing is discordant with the others, intentionally so, because he likes sort of the rough, edgy nature of his own music, and it causes the other music to sort of die down. Well, then Iluvatar introduces a second theme, which, like good jazz musician, in incorporates the discordant note into, you know, augmented fifth sort of thing. Okay, we're going to make a really cool jivey harmony here, and this happens again and again. So he goes off on his own, creates these other notes, but Iluvatar weaves this back in, sort of conducts the rest of the orchestra of the other holy ones to weave this back in, and then they hear the music, and then the music ceases. Oh wow, isn't that really nice? You know, they all get together. We love it. We just made some music. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And then Iluvatar says, now we're going to do it for real. And he sort of rewinds the tape and hits play again. And now they get to see it before their eyes, what their music did, which was the creation of the material cosmos.
Yeah.
And then they all say, hey, that's really cool, and we want to enter into it. Or he says, hey, if some of you want to go down there and actually enter into the microverse and experience it virtually, really, like hands-on. And they say, cool, and some of them do, and then those are the ones that we call the Valar, those who have entered into the space-time continuum in some way. Brief outline.
And if you don't mind my reading the two passages here that are in this. The first is the very opening of the work, which it's a stunning opening, because if you're going to open your actual text, I think Tolkien wants a what, you know, he wants an opening, bing, you know, like in Beowulf.
Yeah.
So he does open with this wonderful chord that occurs, and here's the opening passage. There was Eru, the one, who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made, and he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang, only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly, yet ever, as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. Now, there's a lot there in that section, and you know, Tolkien himself says, "I didn't get a good education in music because I was an orphan, etc., etc." But I'm convinced that he heard great polyphony, or he was familiar with it in some degree, church music perhaps, because he touches on something which people that have been in a choir understand implicitly.
Yep.
First is that you don't start with music when you're singing. You start with hearing what the composer intends for you, either directly, because it used to be without sheet music written down, the composer would sing it and you'd have to repeat it, or you look at it on a page of text that's handed to you by your director, and you have to scan it and understand it, and then you begin singing it. Okay, and in polyphonic music, each person has to practice their own part, and then they come together and they make a single music together. So as you do so, you begin to understand what like I'm a bass baritone. You have to understand after a while what the tenors are like, what the altos are like, what the sopranos are like. You know, you know something about the human being singing through how they interpret and how they sing and how they reference the music, and whether they have a reverence for what they're singing and a good interpretation. Do they sing through their nose? Do they have good projection? Do they have good intonation? Are they flippant about what they're doing? You learn all these things as you're standing in the room with the other people singing along in the piece of music. I have a really good anecdote as far as that goes. When I was singing with Collegium Cantorum, big plug for Collegium Cantorum at University of Dallas, led by Marilyn Walker, God bless her. When I was singing with them, we were singing, all the guys in one room and all the gals in another room, separated by these glass windows, and we were practicing this piece of music for Christmas, and it alternates back and forth, male to female. And as
Mhm.
we're singing our parts, practicing. It ends up they're practicing their parts almost at the same time as we were, and so we began to move our pieces that we're practicing towards what they were practicing, and suddenly we're singing back and forth. We open the doors, and we're singing through the doors, and it was this amazing coming together of the various voices. I just had this vivid memory of just being so happy at that point, not just because we were singing music, but because as humans we were coming together in that singing. And that's kind of what he
Right.
indicates here, is that the choirs of the Ainur, which are male and female, okay,
Mhm.
altos and sopranos and tenors and baritones, are singing the music that's proposed by Iluvatar, and that's bringing them together so that they have more unison through their singing.
Right.
Now, into that, if we add an Arnold Schoenberg, right, a Melchior Schoenberg, um, he comes in and he doesn't want to sing with the rest of the choir. And this is another thing which choirs understand this. Gosh, I can't. I'm getting chills because this is something which, as a choir participant, you understand again implicitly what people outside of that choir don't understand. If you get one voice that wants to show off, to grandstand, or that is flat all the time, or that is not learning their part, or whatever it is, they wreck the entire harmony that you worked so hard to put together.
Exactly.
Okay. And it's very difficult to incorporate that one voice that thinks they're God's gift to music. It's very hard to incorporate them in because they keep singing things that aren't on the page, or singing things that aren't supposed to be there, or overdoing it, or whatever it is. And that leads then to this rebellion, this rebelliousness. Why don't you sing it the way it's supposed to be sung, right? Stop being such a jerk and be part of the choir. It's not slavery, it's rather working together in cohesion with others for the common good.
Mhm.
Um, and then here's the second passage that I want to read, if you don't mind. When he finally shows him the music, this is interesting. I hadn't noticed this before. It says, this is on page 5 in our text.
Mhm.
Um, Then the Ainur were afraid. They did not yet comprehend the words that were said to them, and Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. But Iluvatar arose in splendor, and he went forth from the fair regions that he had made for the Ainur, and the Ainur followed him. But when they were come into the void, Iluvatar said to them, Behold your music. And he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing. And then they see the new world that becomes visible to them. I was really struck this time around with this line. He gave to them sight where before was only hearing. Right.
Yes.
So, in other words, when you have this first singing, the only thing that's there is sound. There's
Mhm.
no there's no vision yet. There's only sound. And the vision comes as a sense, secondary sense, rather than the primary sense, which is sound. That really struck me this time around reading this text. Because
Mm.
again, when you're in a choir, um, there is a moment sometimes when you're singing where you lose. It's almost like an out of body experience, and I'm sure this happens with
Mhm.
other musicians. There's almost an out
Yeah.
of body experience. You are no longer simply a guy playing a trumpet. You're no longer a guy simply playing guitar. You are actually almost like one with the music. And I know that sounds cheesy, but it's as though
Mhm.
hearing has become the only sense, and
Right.
you're filled with that music. And all that you perceive is the music itself, rather than the physical nature of vision and the body. So it's a wonderful insight, I think.
Yes. No, very much. And I think that that's just as you were reading that, it became clear to me. It struck me that this is akin to being born. I think often, at least the modern Western person, probably it can be different in other cultures, is inclined to think that vision is the primary sense, especially in our image saturated, textualized, hypertextualized world. We tend to think that vision is the primary sense for the human being. And I wonder if that's actually just very culturally bounded to our present society. and that others maybe see it differently. I don't know. But in any case, we can say that for sure, biologically, it is not the case, categorically so. Hearing comes first. In the womb, we develop hearing our mother's voice. We hear the world outside, and then at a certain moment, we are born and we come into the light and we see, we are granted vision, where before, though indistinct, perhaps like trees walking, we see
Yeah.
things. We begin to see where before there was only hearing. We see a face and not only hear a voice. And I think that that is very interesting. I never thought about that before.
Mm.
But that in some ways, this is the Ainur being born, right? There's a birth motif here, that born into a new level of reality for themselves as well, because in seeing, we ourselves are changed. But then projecting that back on the primary biological fact that when we are born, there's really an entering into a new stage of reality and creation, similar to how the Ainur experience the birth of the cosmos in their seeing it and not merely hearing it.
Yes, yes. And it honestly, it's an amazing insight too. When we've talked before about the logos as the
Mm-hmm.
mathematical pattern that governs the universe, and the logos is only partly it's expressed through mathematics, but it is primarily a sound-based system.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
uh, and really, it is an expression. It's hard to describe it, but it's an expression of nodal points between ripples within the cosmos. Okay,
Yeah.
um, and if you want a real trip, you go and look up sound waves affecting sand, okay, or something like that.
Mm.
Because there's a
Mm-hmm.
video where a guy puts a plate, sound plate, and he puts sand on it, and then he runs different frequencies through, and the sand actually will shift very suddenly and shift into different geometrical patterns.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa,
Fascinating.
that's amazing. But if we're looking at creation itself, physical world around us, the stuff around us, which is based upon nodal points, really, the physical matter is shaped by points.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but those points, what determines those points? We have, it's not just accidents. It's not just it doesn't happen to become a cup or a tree or a human. What seems to define those points is something mysterious, especially if this is energy cooled down into matter. What actually defines how that energy cools down into the matter? It's for lack of a better word, it's sound. Uh,
It's music.
it's
Yeah.
music. Yeah. Um, so much so, and I this is totally random, but I was reading an article the other day of these guys that did this wacky experiment. You know, humans are weird. We do these weird experiments, and they developed cheese over the course of several years. You know how cheese ages, but during the course of different years, they would play different pieces of music repetitively every month. So they played
Mm-hmm.
Bach, they played Mozart, they played Led Zeppelin, they played Cream, you know, they played John Coltrane, you know, they played Dixieland jazz, and they were measuring how the different sounds actually changed the nature of the cheese. Like,
That's
you're out of your
awesome.
mind. And I wrote to my brother who shared this with me, and I said, you know, correlation does not mean causation. And he wrote back. He said, when you look at the study, the correlation is so high between the actual nodal points of the music and the formation of the cheese that yes, it does mean causation. The music of John Coltrane changed the nature of a
Sure.
freaking cheese. Okay,
Mhm.
so my point being is that if that happens with rounds of Gouda, why is it not happening with matter in general? Matter in general could be determined
Yes.
by sound.
Well,
That's
yes.
startling, you know. You and I.
That's,
Um,
yeah, we may very well be determined by sound, or at least affected.
our
You know, some
cheese.
people have dabbled into the arcane influences of music on the growth of plants and other things, you know, and interesting with interesting results.
Yes,
With
yes,
interesting results.
yes.
And so, yeah, there's something to be, there's this intuition, and it's not unique to wacky experimental scientists here and there, but seems to be common to at least many civilizations, many cultures, not only those that develop cities, but many cultures, if not all, but many, that there is somehow fundamental to the makeup of the universe is music in some way or
Yes.
another,
Right.
right? Whether they have a creation myth that is so explicitly musical as this is the singing into creation of the world, is sung into creation or not, then there's almost everybody, I'll hazard and say almost all cultures that I can think of right now have some sense of the music of the spheres.
Right.
Right.
Johannes Kepler,
Yeah.
the Harmony de Relt, he wrote about that back in the 1600s, right? And
What?
years, yeah.
Yeah, as an and Boethius wrote something.
Yep.
Augustine wrote something that was lost. Ambrose did something. Um, and I think even in, since we're sort of tracking along, going backwards through Christian thinkers, um, I
Plato.
think that but even Plato, right? This is fundamentally, right? And the social effects of music. I mean, he's very much into this. It sees first the musicians and the artists and control that, and you'll shape the society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 And really, this is one of the reasons why, too, in Mass and in other Christian ceremonies, as well as in Jewish, you didn't read the text. You heard someone sing the text.
Mm-hmm.
So we're so
And
used to reading it that we miss the fact that we're doing something that's artificial and is not actually
right,
natural the way it was originally intended.
that's exactly right. And I think even most traditional societies' stories are sung rather than told, even
Yes.
if the melodic composition can maybe rather subtle. They're referred to as being sung. I will
Yeah.
sing you a tale of such. Sing Muse of the Rage of Achilles. So, these various things, and some of these traditional poems that read
Yep.
very rhythmically. Well, we're okay with there being a rhythm, but somehow no, music was not part. They're atonal. Well, it just probably is likely enough that they were tonal. And of course, there's evidence to corroborate that.
Yeah. Right.
If another
Right.
people talking about stories being sung, in fact. Um,
And I find it interesting that when it is sung, it sticks in the head far more than if it's just read. I
oh,
mean, um,
absolutely.
you could even begin a piece of music and people immediately jump off and go with it. If you sit right back and I'll hear the tale of a fateful trip that started on this tropic shore aboard this tropic
Right.
ship. And automatically you're going with the music. It like
Yeah.
flows out of you almost.
If I had to like memorize that from a sheet of paper in, middle school or something, it would just been nothing. Yeah, I can't tell you much. Even Tiger, Tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. It's about as far as I can go. There's something about an immortal hand or eye and symmetry, and then it kind of fades out.
Yes.
But I listened once to some little ditty on the, and all of a sudden I'm going to be an Oscar Mayer Wiener and everything. You remember every word of that because hey, it's a catchy jingle.
Yeah,
Because music does something.
it does. It does. And it does something. Somebody said my one of my great mentors, Father Ralph Mart, he said music is is praying twice, and he I think was
Mm-hmm.
quoting Augustine on that. But
Mm-hmm.
music is praying twice. In a way, the musical element, even when it's not coupled with words, is itself the primary form of prayer almost.
Right.
I'm thinking of the openings of Genesis and of the Gospel of
Mm-hmm.
John. We read them as in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, and we think that's the text is what is important. Um, but I had a real experience when I heard for the first time the Jewish singing of Genesis. The Jewish is
Mm-hmm.
Bereshit bara Elohim, and it's got a rhythmic cadence to itself. Bereshit bara Elohim. But when you hear it sung, it's like that's a totally different beast. It's like you hadn't heard it before. En arche and logos, as John says at the beginning of his
Mm-hmm.
gospel. If you were to hear that sung, it's a totally different thing. The singing has filled up a missing element that the text cannot capture. And
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
to that end, I think that's what he's getting at when he talks about the void. I asked about this earlier. What is that void that
Mm.
Melkor goes into, and that he eventually is headed towards? It certainly seems like the Greek chaos pit, the pit of chaos,
Yeah, in
like
fact, they all
dark.
seem to go even and when they're done singing at some point, Iluvatar gathers them together, and they all kind of walk over to the void, and they look into it, and then
Yeah,
they sing, and then he shows them what they made. They walk over to it, like they leave the antechambers of the celestial court and go over to the void, the edge, and look over down into the void. It's a place,
yep, yep.
right?
And there is suspended that new world where he sends the
Hmm.
celestial fire, the eternal fire, into Ea, right? And it becomes Arda, the world,
Right. Ea, that which is.
that which
Like
is.
it's just cool.
Yeah, I
Being. You
know.
just created being. And awesome
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. But in a way, that void, it
Hmm.
seems to me, it's like that's the event horizon. Okay, uh, in uh,
Yes.
in science, when you're looking at a black hole, there's a point you come to where you can't deny the gravitational pull of the black hole, and you're drawn to it no matter what you do.
You're
You
now
cannot
sucked
escape gravity.
in.
So beyond that event horizon is space that you can get out of the gravitational pull. So in a way, this
Hmm.
is like an event horizon. I think the void
Yeah.
is. It's as though when you're singing, the song goes out into the vast cathedral of darkness, and it echoes back. But there's a point where if it goes further than X point, it starts to dissipate and eventually is gone. Okay.
Right.
Again, if I can use an anecdote, with our singing when we went to Germany with the choir with Collegium Cantorum, we
Yeah.
went to Cologne Cathedral, and Cologne Cathedral is massive. It's a huge cathedral that
Right.
really wasn't finished apparently until the 19th century. And it's a when you go there at night, you look up, you
Hmm.
literally can't see the ceiling because it's that dark. Okay, and so it's quite an experience. And we went there. We got there at night. We were all tired. We get off the train. We go into the cathedral. And we were going to do a warm up, and warm up in Germany in winter is actually cold up because everything's freezing.
Hmm.
And so we start to sing, and the sound didn't go anywhere. It was like there was no echo hardly. It was almost like the building itself was oppressive in the dark, and we couldn't sing outwards into the darkness. It was a strange experience. Well, come the morning when we had mass there in the morning, and the windows are all facing east, so the sun is blazing through these stained glass windows in this glorious white and colored light. When we started to sing, it was like you're singing into a crystal bell. Like
Mm.
the, the notes went out and just soared through the cathedral in the lightness of the morning. It was a truly amazing experience. I think the void, as he describes it here, is that darkness, that oppressive darkness, into which that song doesn't really reach, and
Right.
and into which notes begin to evaporate as they go further and further into that void. Which is
Hmm.
which is why Melkor and Sauron go into that void at the end of the next book, they're dissipating. Really, they
Yeah.
aren't increasing; they're dissipating. Um,
Right.
and when it says Melkor goes into the void, it says something to the effect of, well, here it is, page 4. He had gone off on alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame. For desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. Why does he seek the imperishable flame in the void? It's an odd thing. That's
Mm.
misguided. And he's not
Right.
on
Because
fire.
the imperishable flame is. Sorry. You're good.
No, no, you were saying the same thing.
No, this is yeah. That's in the heart of Iluvatar. That's not
That's
a
an illusion.
void. What are you doing over there?
Yeah, yeah. It's a really striking image to me that somehow you'd go out into the darkness to find the light.
Right.
But really, there's only one light, and it's from the Iluvatar. Uh,
Right.
but it's also a great example of that twisting that he talks about when he talks about the fall and mortality and the machine. You know?
Hmm. Yeah. Seeking to seize control, and first he's looking for something, and then he begins to wrest the harmony away from the rest of the Ainur and
Yeah.
enforce his own will. And so fairly quickly, gradually rather, I should say, but gradually, progressively, it becomes more and more forcing of will, a technique, a
I
machinations. And in fact, we see later on the machinations of Melkor, who becomes named Morgoth, in doing this, that, and the other thing, which we see elaborated, obviously, in the Silmarillion.
yeah.
What
Yeah.
I think is an interesting thing at this point, when they go and they behold in the void what the world that they've co-created, is that we should realize that they're seeing the whole thing transtemporally, because they're still outside of time. Or that's what characterizes the Ainur, is that they're outside of time. So they see the whole thing from beginning to end in its completion, sort of, I don't know, pulsating or emanating life and light, but they're looking at even time in a three-dimensional way at this point.
Yes.
And so we've heard the creation. Now they see the creation, not like here's the thing and here's the world and it's just started, and then we'll watch it now for the next 25 bajillion years. But rather they're seeing it all together, the whole fabric, the done piece, the complete piece. And I think that's really interesting, because then what follows later in the Ainalundale here towards the end is there's this third move. There's three movements. There's the first movement, they sing the symphony. Second movement, they get to see what it is that they made. And the third movement, those who so choose can descend from this
Yep.
high ranking right next to Iluvatar down into the creation, and materially what they realize as soon as they get there is, hey, wait a minute, they've now encountered, there's a new experience for a quasi eternal being, is the experience of time. They all of a sudden find themselves limited, and that they step down into this beautiful creation, and it's not the done project, it's not the finished project yet. They're stepping into it when it's still just particles moving about, dust and sparks. And they begin to manipulate it and reenact now that which they sang in the beginning, and then that which they saw. They now physically, as it were, become a part of, and moving things around and creating water, air, light, dark, eventually rocks and trees and everything else.
Yeah, that's a really interesting image that he brings up. He doesn't create an inert matter world. It's not a world where
Mm-hmm.
was it the clockmaker God? Where God makes the world and like runs away. Yeah, let it work itself out. Rather, it's a world where the Ainur are, some of them are so in love with that world that they actually go into it and are there when the events of Silmarillion and Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are still happening. And so by extraction, you could say they're still there because this is a pre-world, our world. They're still there in our world, and it's not a what do they call pantheism, where the God is in everything. It's these spirits or powers are in everything. And we may want to wait until next time to talk about that, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
startling thing that they go into it through love, except for Melkor, who's
Right.
he's the Arnold Schoenberg, Uh, the rest of them go into it through love of that world and love of the beauty of that world. Let me back up just a minute too. When they see the song, well, when they're introduced to the song, it says Iluvatar
Mm-hmm.
proposed the music. They began singing. Okay, so it's like the
Mm-hmm.
director of the music hands out the music, and everybody begins singing that music. And in the
Right.
course of that, you could say they knew the beginning, the middle, and the end of the music, but they didn't see the absolute result of it, which again is kind of
Mm-hmm.
startling from a choir perspective, because you get handed the music and it was 3 pages of Thomas Tallis,
Right.
like, oh, I got it,
Right.
okay, because you could read music and so you know where the music goes. So in terms of providence or predestination or whatever we want to call it, you see where
Mm-hmm.
every person is going to be, every note, every little punctus is going to land. But then you sing it and you get another sense of what these puncti are like, and these correcti and all this. And then once you've sung it and it goes out into the world, then you get people coming
Mm-hmm.
back, eyes full of tears, being like, "Oh, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, and I haven't heard that since I was a child, and you changed my life, and you changed my day."
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of like seeing what you've created afterwards. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And it is like, people always ask, well, how does God know what we're going to do in the future? Boethius says he doesn't know what you're going to do in the future. He knows what you're doing in the present because he's the eternal now.
Right.
Very similar to an artist. Once he's created the thing, it's the eternal now. He knows the beginning, the middle, and the end of it, and it's
Right.
not in time. It's not in time that this unfolds because it's there on the page already.
Right.
It's only in time that it has manifestation in the void. It's an interesting thought.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks very much. That's very true. And I think, and this is something definitely to launch to the next episode, but to expand a little bit upon this notion that it's neither inert matter, nor is the matter itself God, pantheism. And yes, the divine, because he says, it very explicitly mentions that the imperishable fire is put into it. So there is a sort of panentheism in that there's something of the divine life of Iluvatar, Eru, the One, in all this world that's created, but that you've got these other agencies, these other spiritual beings acting, living, moving within the world, not just as like artist assistants, putting up the final splotches of paint on the fresco, and then there it is. But they're part of the game.
Yeah.
They're on stage. They're planted. They're moving things around, more or less behind the scenes or visible to the audience, depending on whether they will to be seen or not. But these powers of the universe are there, and that's a very different view of the world than I think most people in the modern West conceive of.
Yeah, most people don't like Norman Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It shines forth like a shimmering from shook foil. Most people don't see that. They see God in his place on Sundays, especially.
Thankfully up there.
Matter. Yeah, he's up there somewhere. It's like
he's over there.
Guy.
We're down here, or maybe he's got the whole world in his hands, but but there's nobody moving. It's a very different experience if you start to think that right over your shoulder at any moment, some god or goddess could unveil their face and say, boo, you feel their musty breath upon your shoulder.
Yeah, a little bit scarier in a way, to think that Thor is always there,
Mm-hmm.
You're right. And we may want to talk next time about what does that mean? What is being got at here? These manifestations, if you will.
What are these? What do we properly call them? And what are the other quick? Tolkien cites a lot of sources where he's drawing inspiration from, and where do we see that elsewhere in this world? Other traditions, other versions of this kind of these accountings of these different kinds of beings, and how can that help us understand what Tolkien has here with the Ainur and the Valar, and we'll see the Maiar and everything, and then how can they help us understand the real world we actually live in?
Yep. And I want to talk too, Cameron, about this idea of the machine. We've touched on the fall, to some degree on mortality, but I want to talk more about this machine idea that Tolkien brings up, especially as we see it beginning to arrive through Morgoth, Melkor, here in the Ainalundale and then in the Valaquenta. So maybe next time that would be a good thing to touch on. And
I think that's right. And those I think treating those together is very apt.
Yeah.
Because you've got, on the one hand, a living cosmos with real living beings in it that are moving things about. So they're part of it, right? Yeah. There's this other living organicness. And the other hand, you've got this analytical gaze of the basilisk that kills everything that it looks at and takes the, in the sense of analysis, you literally breaking things apart to take the pieces together and manipulate them into some way. That's a much more mechanistic view of the world. Or even seeing the world as a great, well-constructed clock versus a living organism, like a bed of moss or lichens with microbes moving up and down, shimmering, luminescent.
Like that. Yeah. Well, next time when we do talk, because we'll probably have to call it quits here. Next time when we do talk, I really want to get into that. And I also want to talk too about these various gods. What, why does he go so much at length in the next chapter of the Valaquenta? Why does he go so much at length to talk about what they have? What are their auspices? Why does he do that? And is this at all related to what we talk about when we talk about the choirs of angels, the ranks of angels?
Yeah.
because that would be, I think, a very good thing to think about.
Things to look forward to
Yeah,
next episode. So
yeah.
see us back here next week. Those of you watching, and those who've not yet been granted vision, listen.